Hello, welcome to Questions of Life. I'm Cath and I'm here with Donald.
Hello, everyone.
It is lovely to welcome you. Now, this evening we are looking at who is Jesus. Now, last week, Donald, we began to look at how can we be sure that God exists. And at the end, as I was summing up, I said to you, Donald, tell us, can we be sure that God exists? And your answer was?
I felt guilty about this. I said probably.
Probably.
Which I meant to be stronger than probably, but we can't prove it for certain.
Yes. And so in our session last week, we were looking at pieces of evidence that kind of point towards the existence of God, and we then make an informed and a reasoned decision. Now, as part of that, we began to talk a little bit about what God is like. And you talked about the fact that Jesus reveals to us something of God's character. And so we're going to take that on tonight, and we're going to focus on who is Jesus and a whole host of other questions around that. But just to start, just in a nutshell, just say for us, why do you think that Jesus is such a significant part of Christianity and of our world?
Right. Well, I think it's absolutely central and crucial wherever we're coming from for lots of different reasons. I mean, I think firstly, if we are coming looking for some evidence, we know there is a historical figure called Jesus. So what is the explanation for the impact he's had on our world? If we're coming at it from a very strongly anti-Christian sort of atheist view, then a lot of that's based on the perception of God from the Old Testament, and Jesus blows that out of the water. If we're coming and looking at faith from a sort of religious background, and we've got lots of experience of religion, and again, Jesus blows that out of the water and really challenges the way religions operate and the way people perceive and behave within religion. And if we're coming from it just trying to say, I don't understand God, just explain God to me, then again, Jesus is the best way of trying to understand who God is and what he's like. So whatever angle you're approaching faith, Jesus is the answer.
Great. Two things to say. Firstly, if you can hear snoring, that is Shrey. That is Donald's dog. She's just very quietly just fallen asleep. Just woken up there, which is fantastic. Second thing, just in the midst of what you were saying, you said, of course, that Jesus was a real man who lived on our earth, a historical figure. Tell us a little bit more about that, because we've got the Bible, but for many people, they're like, okay, that's just a religious book. It's not a historical document. Why are you so certain that he was a real man who lived on our earth?
Basically, because there are lots of other historical records that talk about a man called Jesus who lived at the time that Jesus lived. One of the most famous is a Jewish historian called Josephus, who wrote about 50 years after Jesus. So, if you like, he's writing a history of the 1950s, the 1960s today, which we would consider to be fairly accurate. And he talks about this man called Jesus who had disciples, who was crucified by the Romans, and who his disciples, his followers, believed had risen from the dead. The Roman records talk about the followers of Jesus were executed, were fed to thrown to gladiators, fed to lions for lots of different reasons. And the records say that these people believed that Jesus was Lord and they wouldn't denounce him. We know when that began. From the Roman records, we know that before that, nobody had ever talked about being a Christian. Nobody ever talked about a man called Jesus. Nobody ever talked about following him. So we know that at the time the Bible says there was a man called Jesus, a man called Jesus transformed the Middle East in community under the Roman occupation. That's beyond historical doubt. In fact, there's probably more evidence that Jesus existed than some of the other people that we would consider to be completely certain of as historical figures, sort of between that time and 1,000 years AD. So in that first sort of period, he's pretty certain. There's lots and lots of different accounts of how people were transformed by him and what they believed about him.
So there's this certainty from historians that he was a real man, an actual living, breathing man, flesh and blood and bones, not just some ghostly, ethereal character. They're certain that he died by being crucified. They talk about him being a teacher. They talk about him possibly having performed miracles, although some historians are skeptical. And we'll come on to it.
People believed he performed miracles.
Yes, but whether historians believed that actually was true, we'll come on to. So there is this correlation between actual historical fact and the Bible. The two aren't poles apart, but there's loads of similarities. So let's explore then this man, Jesus. And for me, one of the interesting things is that in the Bible, in the first half of the Bible, the Old Testament, so over 500 years before Jesus came to be born and live and breathe on our earth, God spoke to a group of people, the Israelites. And they were a bunch of Muppets, a little bit like us today. They did things that were really great, and they did things that weren't so great. And God had a message for them. He said he was going to send someone to save them. And in their minds, they had this idea that they thought he was going to be this historical, this great political leader. And throughout the Old Testament, for about 500 years, God is giving them pieces of information as to what this person's going to be like that he's going to send. So he tells them that it's going to be born of a virgin in Bethlehem. And so we get to the wonderful Christmas nativity story, and we hear this phrase that, Jesus is born of a virgin. Talk us through that, because there are so many people that are skeptical about the virgin birth. There's a line of thinking that says, well, Mary and Joseph, bit of a cover story. Really, was it the Immaculate Conception? Talk about that, and talk about why you think it's important.
Well, in a way, I think the virgin birth is probably one of the lesser things to worry about. Because one of the if I park it for a moment, one of the things that's fundamental about Jesus is in the 3 years of his ministry, he lived and acted as though he was the God who created the world in human form. Now that was beyond people's understanding. That was considered blasphemy, and eventually that's what he was crucified for blasphemy. So the most difficult thing for the people to get their heads round was that the God of the universe, the God who has all the power in all the world, could be confined into a human body, could be confined to a baby. So for the early people who were encountering Jesus, they weren't particularly worried about the virgin birth bit. They were just astounded that he could be God. Once, and we can explore, perhaps you'll ask me more as to why we think he was God, but once you get to that point, we're saying, okay, God's come to earth, actually it makes perfect sense then for his birth to be completely different to any other human being's birth. And for the way in which his life was formed in Mary's womb to be completely different. So I don't find that a particularly difficult step of faith. I think the hardest step of faith is that God became a human being. Once he's become a human being, virgin birth, obvious, easy, straightforward. That's the obvious way to do things. What is more complex is that he should be God.
So this baby, God, is born, and for most important people, they're not born in a stable. They're not born in the circumstances that Jesus was. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us how that encourages us and the significance of that for us today.
Yeah, so what you get all the time with Jesus is you're getting an understanding of the nature and character of God. And that birth is significant because it's humble. It's amongst either the very poor or at least ordinary people. There's a little bit of debate. But certainly he wasn't born in a palace. He wasn't born amongst the rich and the wealthy or the important and significant. He was born in a place of vulnerability. There's an element of rejection. He was born where there wasn't room for him for whatever reason, and scholars debate exactly what was going on there. But there is some symbolism to the fact that he was born with the animals. Whether that was a cave, a stable, whatever, we know he was laid in a manger. He was laid in a trough. And we like to sanitize it by calling it a manger. It was a trough. It was what the donkeys or the oxes ate out of. We're really paranoid about hygiene at the moment. Jesus was not born in a clean, safe place. He was born to ordinary people. And yes, the wise men came, so there's this element of wealth, but the shepherds came too, the representative of the ordinary working people. And so there's great symbolism in that Christmas story.
That Jesus just came into the ordinary. Understands what it's like to live an ordinary life, rejection, all of those things. Which I find really encouraging, because you think of the most important people in the world, and we'll maybe talk about this in a minute, you talk about someone like Donald Trump, who won't even allow people to ask a simple question without him walking out of a press conference, let alone getting close to them and being a man of the people. And yet here's Jesus, who we would say is the Son of God, is the most important person to ever have walked on this earth. And he was born in a stable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was laid in a trough.
Yeah.
Blows your mind.
It does.
You just think that's countercultural. That shouldn't be.
Yes. And that really upsets religion.
Yes.
It's very difficult for religions to grasp that God can be ordinary.
Yes. So he understands the ordinariness of the human race.
He identifies with us. He comes to us. He seeks us out. And he wants to be part of us.
So we move on a little bit. There's not much that's written about Jesus' childhood. There's just the one story about him and his family going off with thousands of others to a religious festival. And his parents lose sight of him because he's remained in the temple. And he's remained in there because that's his father's house. That he has a sense, even from a child, of his identity, that he isn't an ordinary child, but he is the Son of God. Then, when he's 30, everything kicks off. So why did he wait until he was 30? And then what happens?
I think he waits because I think it's about identifying with humanity. So it talks about him having human experiences and learning and experiencing life. And I think if he had been a child prodigy, I think it would have been harder for us to identify with him. But
he'd have been annoying, wouldn't he? Like some of those.
Yeah. So you have this normal life of him living with ordinary people, of him training to be a carpenter probably, in his father's business probably. Nothing that particularly stands out other than the birth and that experience when he was 10 or 11. Everything else is normal, and I think that's right. I think that's good. So that when the whole thing kicks off, when he turns water into wine, there's a sense of he understands life. I remember when I first said to people I wanted to go into Christian ministry, and I was about 16, and the guy said to me, go and get a normal job and come back when you're 20. And that was the best advice I'd ever had. Just go out and live life. And Jesus does that for 13, well, probably 15, 20 years. He's living normal life. And there's a bit later on in the New Testament where it says he understands our weaknesses. And he knows what life is like. And I think that's great.
That's really important, isn't it? And you now know, having worked in a menswear department, you can tell somebody's shirt size just by looking at them, can't you?
I can.
That's your magical gift.
That is my hidden talent, that having sold men's shirts for a few years, I can tell what size a man is.
So Jesus turns water into wine, and you can do shirt sizes. You know, each man to their own. So the first inkling of who Jesus is this instant that he performs this miracle. He turns water into wine, and it's at his mother's instigation, isn't it? So he's not really wanting to get involved.
Yeah.
And she's like...
Yeah. I mean, timing in the New Testament is always difficult to weigh down because the New Testament writers tell the stories, and some of them link them thematically, some of them link them chronologically. Whether it happens after he's been baptized, after John the Baptist has said, this is the Son of God. Yeah. But it's one of the first miracles. Let's put it that way. It's the first miracle that he does. And Mary says, they're running out of wine, so he turns the water into wine. And again, everything that he does reveals something about God. And that, I guess, reveals God's delight in celebration, delight in feast and party. Not all the time. The Bible has a season of feasts and festivals, different to ours, but nevertheless it's good to have special days. They're special because the other days are normal. So there's a celebration, and God's right in the midst of it.
I think it's interesting as well. They turned the water into the finest wine. So it was at the point in the party that if you'd been drinking, you wouldn't really notice the quality of the wine, but it was still the best. Yeah. And it was from the most skanky foot washing water. Yeah. You just think that's incredible.